Hello and welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines. I'm Ryan Gilchrest, Managing Editor for the Post and Courier's newsrooms in Greenville and Spartanburg. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about land conservation in the Upstate and in some senses South Carolina as a whole, but mostly focusing on the Upstate. I'm going to be talking today with one of our reporters, Nathaniel Cary. He has lived up in the Greenville area for quite some time and like me has an interest in all things outdoors. So this is a topic we chat about on occasion anyway. But the reason we're here today is Nate's covered a few stories recently that I think relate to the topic. So we're going to talk about that. So Nate, we'll get to you in just a second. Before we get started, a quick plug for the Post and Courier. Please do consider digital subscription to the Post and Courier. It supports everything we do, including these expansions across the state, and it enables us to continue to serve you and offer up things like this every day. If you don't quite want to make that much commitment, do check out our newsletters, especially the Greenville one comes out daily, where we share headlines with you. I'll give you more information on that at the end of this, but without further ado, let's get into today's topic. So, Nate, here's the question we want to start with. One of the readers, Greg, asked for the whole package in layman's terms. When we say land conservation in the Upstate, what are we talking about?
I guess as a broader look back at conservation in general, it really kind of began with Abraham Lincoln first setting aside land for Yosemite National Park. So that's the big picture looking back. And so mid 1800s. Then by the mid 1900s, South Carolina, other states as well, got on board. They began buying land, setting aside, creating state park systems, truly setting aside kind of a network and large chunks of land that they wanted to conserve from any type of development. And then towards the second half of the 1900s, South Carolina and particularly in the Upstate, where we're talking about today, focusing on, it was driven by individuals and smaller groups and conservation-focused groups that wanted to preserve the beauty that was here as they saw more and more development coming to the area. And so by the early 1900s or 1990s, conservation easements became available. And that's what has driven a large part of the actual land acreage in the Upstate that's been, and in South Carolina, that's been set aside in the last 30 or so years. A conservation easement, and when we talk about conservation, much of the land that is conserved is not publicly accessible. A large chunk of that land is still privately owned. And in most cases, it's still managed privately and not, it's not hiking trails like you would think of just adding to state parks. It's a farm or a several hundred acres of wooded forest land, and it's individual families or groups of children who've inherited land, who say we don't want to see this developed as a subdivision. We don't want to see this as industrial or houses sprinkled over it in this mountain area. We'd like to see it conserved and preserved like it is, but we also want to be able to have it managed and have a program to make sure that it's being managed correctly. And so that's where some groups come in and help to do that and manage those easements. So that's a small level. And then there's state parks that are adding to them, and there's trusts that are purchasing or facilitating purchase of land, and we'll get into a lot more of that today. That's what we've seen recently, and even utilities that are now getting involved.
Right.
So it's a large topic, and there's a lot of different avenues.
Right. Yeah, and I know that from an outside perspective, it can sometimes seem a little bit dense. But just on sort of the short list, who are some of the main players in the Upstate that factor into some of the other things we're going to talk about today?
Okay, so we have some national players that are involved in the Upstate, like the Nature Conservancy. national nonprofit that is involved in purchasing or helping to facilitate purchase of land here. Some of the state conservation banks, so South Carolina taxpayers fund each year, if the legislature allows it, General Assembly approves it in the budget, puts aside funding for conservation. So they help to facilitate projects for the state parks and otherwise. Of course, you've got the state park system and the state itself, which can purchase land for its state park system. And then you've got trusts like the Natural Land Trust, begun by environmentalist and conservationist Tommy Weish from Greenville and he began his work in the 1960s and 70s. It began Natural Land Trust as a way to purchase and to facilitate purchase of properties and conservation of properties, sometimes with the intent of turning those over to another group or to the state park system. And then you've got Upstate Forever, which manages, has land trust aspect to it and manages a lot of these conservation easements that are privately owned. And then even more local level and new, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, Greenville County has begun its own historic and natural land, historic, I got to make sure I get the name right here, Greenville County Historic and Natural Resources Trust, which it began last year. And so we're seeing counties, including Oconee County, Charleston County, Beaufort County, and I believe even York County now have begun their own conservation banks at a county level. So it's becoming more granular across the state of who's recognizing areas that need to be protected and taking action on a local level.
So you mentioned Greenville County getting into the game on this fairly recently. They set aside some money. They set up a board. Recently, there was sort of the first announcement they really kind of were connected to. Not that there aren't other things, but publicly. Talk a little bit about how that Greenville County has set up that board and how the effort's progressing there.
So there was a group of business leaders actually kind of drove this effort and wanted more land to be conserved and recognized that the county could help in that effort. The county previously they've asked for money from the State Conservation Bank. They've received lots of money from federal, national sources, trusts, and Conservation Bank itself over the years, with the county never participating itself in that. They recognized it'd be a lot better, and it would position the county better to receive funds and to get additional funding if they had their own board, if they had their own trust that they could say, hey, we'll contribute this much if you will match, and they can kind of grow that pot to be able to purchase or conserve large areas of land. So at a county level, they made an effort last year to pass this for the first time and create this Historic and Natural Resources Trust, which county council and the county manages and facilitates, has control over, and they appointed a board of local leaders and stakeholders who will take applications for projects. They'll review those applications on their merits and whether they can get it done, what the use of the project would be, and then they can approve those on a lower level of amount under $200,000. They could approve those projects themselves. Larger projects would still go back to county council for final approval. They have a series of applications that they've already gone through and they're working their way through. But they recently closed on their first project, which is a significant one in northern Greenville County. And they've got a number of other projects in the works, as I said, across the county. And they've got right now $1 million budget for each year for the first 2 years. So they're working their way through that funding right now. And that's the first time that Greenville County taxpayers have contributed to conservation efforts in the county.
We'll get back to what you mentioned about the project in northern Greenville County here in just a minute, but you mentioned one word in there that I think is worth highlighting for readers. It's the word match. So we talk about all of these organizations and how they work together. In a lot of cases, these projects get done with multiple organizations combining matching grants, matching funds, chipping in. And every project's a little bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, every project is different. And oftentimes if you read a story about these, and I write it often enough, one of us is writing a story that says this acreage was set aside or was conserved, preserved, and here's the use, and here's the list of partners that contributed to make it happen. And that's somewhat by design. That at a state level, they want to see that there's local buy-in to something. At the local level, they want to say we've leveraged our money. We've contributed for this recent project $100,000, but we were able to leverage that by receiving $500,000 from this group and $70,000 from this group, and it all goes together to make it happen. Right. So there's, and then they can each say to their people who follow those groups and are interested in that topic, here's how that money's being used and how it's spread across all these different groups. So we often will see multiple groups, multiple agencies, nonprofit and government agencies listed as part of these projects.
So the project in northern Greenville County you mentioned is definitely one of those. There are a lot of players in that. You were out there last week at a very damp, very muddy event a few days after the rain. Tell us a little bit about what you saw out there and about the event itself and about the property.
Yeah, so the property is called River Falls, and this is in northern Greenville County, and it is close to and will eventually be part of Jones Gap State Park. It is a beautiful piece of property, and it's different from a lot of the properties that are part of Jones Gap or any of the state parks up there, in that it's got a significant area of flat land bordering the Middle Saluda River. And so there's flat spaces, and then it goes across the road and up into the mountains. So there's ridge lines, there's peaks that are a part of this property as well. All wooded, one family home on the property, and it was a beautiful day, and a bit muddy because we've had days of rain leading up to that. But they had an event where they invited locals, they invited officials, they invited all of these different partners that we'll talk about to this property to officially commemorate the purchase and close on this property. This was sold by a family that had owned it and chose to conserve it. They didn't want to see it developed into housing development or something like that. They recognized the significance of and value of the property as it is, undisturbed. And so Natural Land Trust took the lead on this project, and they took ownership of the site with assistance from a number of other groups. And there's going to be an application for funding from the federal Land and Water Conservation Fund to develop plans for the site. And the intention is that it's going to be turned over to South Carolina State Parks and be an addition of 170 acres to Jones Gap Park there. So some of the features of that, because it's got flat level ground, the state park system wants to build, of course, trails throughout, but they also want to add trails, and because there's flat area near the river, they can add some mobility trails for people who can add some handicap access, or some people with mobility issues who can't hike up the mountains. And so they'll add some for that, and then they'll also be able to add quite a bit more parking, which if you've ever gone to Jones Gap or any of our state parks in recent memory in the northern part of Greenville County, parking is at a premium. Somewhere between 30 and 60 something spaces that are available at Jones Gap now. So this will add a significant new parking area and access into Jones Gap State Park.
Right. Yeah, I know in some of the reporting we've done in the past, Jones Gap in particular, additional accessibility has certainly been something that's been a topic of discussion. I wrote last year about 300 acres that would eventually sort of join up, with Mountain Bridge Wilderness Area, which is sort of encompasses Jones Gap as well. But one thing I know that sort of said before, for those of you who are familiar with Jones Gap State Park, was they didn't want to expand the current parking area. They want more traffic coming in through that way. If you've been up that way, it's kind of a tight area in there. It's right between two sort of steep sides of the hill, a little valley tucked in. So yeah, this will add additional access to Jones Gap State Park without sort of expanding what's existing now. So getting back to sort of the partners in this, and we'll sort of use this River Falls example. There was an interesting player in this particular deal, and it was a utility company, Easily Combined Utilities. What are they doing in there? What was their interest in this particular effort?
Sure, it's very interesting that Easily Combined Utilities, which is not located in Greenville County, contributed to purchase River Falls property, and they did it because Saluda River runs into Saluda Lake, which is their drinking water source for all of their customers, drinking water, your water customers in the city of Easley. This is the first time that the city of Easley has chosen this path to try to conserve and preserve its source of drinking water. And Joel Ledbetter with Easily Combined Utilities was at this event the other day, spoke about how they had spent time, effort, and a significant amount of money dredging hundreds of thousands of yards of silt from Saluda Lake that had worked its way downstream through the Saluda River through development or as a result of development. And they had done that just a few years ago, and then went and looked at it again, and it had filled almost entirely back up again with silt. So they realized they needed to change their strategy. And so they began to look at, all right, how can we protect our headwaters and protect, try to keep as much silt from flowing into the lake, to protect from development along the access points to the lake. And this was a project that significantly sets them up to protect that whole area from further development and more silt being washed out into the lake. So we've got a utility, a government agency that is now working in conservation in a neighboring county to protect its headwaters. If you live in Greenville County, our great water source has been protected for decades now, and using this same method of conserving everything that's around the Greenville Reservoir to protect the headwaters for our water source, our main water source, and that was done through conservation. And Tommy Weiss, of course, was involved in that. Greenville Water System involved in that. So now we've got more utilities that are looking to get involved in conservation to protect their own interests in protecting their drinking water.
we got an email this week, and among other things, it sort of referred to the strategy of conservation as random. I think random acts of preservation or conservation was sort of what came up in there. In what ways is that fair, and in what ways is that sort of an unfair statement? It's maybe a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, it does seem random at times. If you're just looking at, if you take a map and you look at what's been preserved, what's been conserved, it's a piece here and a piece here and a property here and a significant chunk here, and then it's nothing around it, and then another piece of property. So if you take a kind of a big look at it, it can seem kind of random of what types are chosen and where and how, and who owns it. So it can seem that way. I guess the boiled down reason is because a lot of these properties, all of these properties, at one point were privately owned, and many of them are family-owned properties. They were farms or just forest land, wooded areas, or timberland, that the state and local officials to get a broad stroke of this entire area is conserved, would have to use some sort of taking of property or eminent domain to preserve the entirety of it. So they don't want to do that. So they respect landowners' rights, and so they rely on landowners choosing to conserve their property, or they are bidding on this property if it's for sale, just like any other bidders. So that's how it seems like there's a kind of a patchwork to it, but it's when a property of significance comes available, or they realize it may be sought after, they work to, different groups will work together to try to preserve that. And so that's how you get 170 acres in one chunk, because that's a family who said, we want to conserve our land. And they say, okay, we can add this onto this other piece of property. And they've had 300 acres recently that in that same area that was preserved, that was conserved, purchased by a natural land trust. And so they say, okay, we can add this significant area and then add another one next to it. And so there's a strategy, but it's all at the behest of the homeowner, the landowner, and what they want to do with their property.
At the very least, there's efforts on the part of a lot of these groups to make these pieces contiguous, to connect them together, particularly along water sources. But it really does come down to the current landowner, right? I mean, there's no real pressure or anything. It ultimately comes down to, does the private landowner want to conserve the land or not?
Right, and that's what makes so significant what the work that Tommy Weish did in the 1960s and 70s and 80s in Greenville County, and then across the Upstate, by when they found out that Duke Energy may want to conserve 40,000 acres of land that the utility owned in Jocassee Gorges. That became their focus for years to make that happen. And that's 40,000 acres all at once. And then you add to that Jones Gap State Park and Caesar's Head State Park, the Mountain Bridge Wilderness area, that they were able to conserve huge chunks of land all at one time, is why we have the vistas that we have in northern Greenville County and Pickens County, Oconee County. Is because of that foresight from decades ago of seeing that map and saying, I don't want this to look like the hills around Los Angeles, where there's houses everywhere. I want this to keep that natural beauty that it has.
Shifting gears slightly. So a couple of weeks ago, you managed to convince me to let you go hiking on the clock, which was work. tell us a little bit about that. So this was up at Sassafras Mountain. What did you see?
Yeah, it was work on in a couple levels, physical labor and mental as well. So drove up to Sassafras Mountain, which from my house in Simpsonville is quite a haul. It was about an hour and 20-minute drive. So the reason was a North Carolina state parks had created a trail to South Carolina's highest peak, Sassafras Mountain. And this is a direct access trail that they were opening, and I chose to go on that and asked if I could cover that as a news story for our South Carolina readers, because it's South Carolina's highest point, where a observation deck was built in 2019, I believe, is when that opened, and there was a road to, a paved access road. You can drive to the top of Sassafras Mountain very easily, but it wasn't always easy to hike to the top of Sassafras Mountain. And for South Carolina folks to hike to our highest peak, it took the assistance of North Carolina to make that happen, because it's at the peak of Sassafras is at the where the two state lines come together on that ridge. And the trail is part of Headwaters State Park or State Forest in North Carolina, and they built a trail with the help of Nature Conservancy and other groups and fundraising. Built a trail from the address is Brevard, North Carolina, up to the peak of Sassafras Mountain, and it crosses over into South Carolina near the top. It's about maybe a 45-minute hike, very gentle through beautiful forests, beautiful ferns throughout the forest, and a gentle hike on most of it, what was an old logging road. And there's free parking, gravel parking lot at the bottom, and it's maybe you can spend an hour and a half, 2 hours going up, doing the observation tower, and coming back down. Great for us that North Carolina was willing to help give us access to that in a direct way. It would rank, I think, as the 36th or 37th highest peak in North Carolina. So it's not much significance to them, but the North Carolina folks there were bragging about how they helped us. There are a couple other routes that you can take to get to the top of Sassafras Mountain from Caesar's Head State Park or Table Rock State Park. It's a 10 or a 15-mile hike, and there's one other route along the Foothills Trail that's about a 5-hour hike. This is a much quicker kind of direct access route that most people with children could do.
One question that came in from someone watching along here, just to follow back on something we asked earlier, that she asked, did I hear you say at the top of the conversation that Oconee County already has its own trust? That's was created prior to Greenville's, right? A few years back.
It was. Oconee County calls theirs the Oconee County Conservation Bank, and it has a board that's appointed by county council that manages that trust. But it works in much the same way as Greenville County's, where they provide funding. The board takes applications for projects and seeks funding for those from county council, and then they can use that to leverage from other sources.
One other question before we go. This one was sent in prior to us jumping on. We had a reader ask about preserving neighborhood wild space or conserving neighborhood wild space. And I know what we're mostly talking about today is more rural areas, but they asked undeveloped land in residential areas, how do you preserve it? And I guess the answer is the current property owner has to want to do that. It's more difficult in developed areas, isn't it?
Yeah, it is more difficult in developed areas, and a lot of these conservation easements, you're not seeing those in more urban areas. It's a lot easier to get those easements in other locations. There have been instances of a county or a city or somebody coming in and purchasing closed golf courses. Flat Rock, North Carolina, has a public park and kind of wildlife area on a closed golf course, but that took the landowner, deciding to sell to the city, county for that reason. So what could happen? It would take an effort to set aside land like that in a more suburban environment, and it would take the landowner saying that's what I'd like to do with the land rather than develop it as a subdivision or some other use.
Right. The pricing can be slightly different as well. One other question that's popped in: is there a minimum acreage that is considered for transfer to various trusts or whatever? And I can answer that one for you. I think we've seen easements and agreements drop in for less than an acre. We've seen thousands of acres. There is sort of no minimum or maximum. It's more about the nature of the land, what it might be used for. One thing I covered specifically last year was a 21-acre easement up next to Table Rock, and it was entirely conserved for the view. It's a place along Highway 11 that people have been pulling off the side of the road forever to take pictures of Table Rock. There's an easement put in place on that, 21 acres of farmland. Now, the owner retained ownership of that property, and all of the agreement there was to basically put in an easement that restricted any future development. And then the money involved was to compensate them for the change in the value of the property. Once it becomes undevelopable, the value per acre is considerably less than if it were to be sold for development. So no, I don't think there's a minimum or maximum. Obviously, there are many people involved in various trusts and conservation groups that could speak more to that. But no, we've seen very, very small pieces of land and very large ones as well. We're a little bit over time. We appreciate so much those of you who watched this and who sent in questions. Nate, in particular, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all for watching Beyond the Headlines. We'll post this recording on our website in case you want to watch it again or share it with a friend. You should be able to find that fairly soon at postandcourier.com/beyond-the-headlines. You can support our work by signing up for any of our free newsletters. Check us out at postandcourier.com/Greenville/newsletter-sign up. You can also find it in the menu at the top of our website. Paid subscribers make our push to cover every corner of South Carolina possible and help us keep our communities informed. We appreciate your support. Those of you who already subscribed, thank you so much. Those of you who don't, please check us out, postandcourier.com/Greenville/subscribe. That's all for now. On behalf of Nate and the entire Post and Courier crew, thanks so much for listening. Have a great day.